This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searles. This week, Jonathan Bennett and I are talking with Allison Randall, who knows everything, has done everything, and is telling us all kinds of new things that we didn't know before about the whole floss ecosystem. That's coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 611, recorded Wednesday, January 6th, 2021. The Floss Ecosystem. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searles, and I am joined this morning by Jonathan Bennett himself, who, for those watching and not listening, there he is, comes on screen, sitting down so he doesn't give away his true height. So how are you doing this morning?
I'm good. I'm good. It seems like it's been forever since I've been on as a co-host, but you know, the network took a couple of weeks off, and I've had some stuff going on in my life. My daughter was born not too terribly long ago, so that's kept me a little busy. But hey, I'm back, and it's great to be back.
So, is this your first time as a dad, or are you a multiple dad now?
I'm a multiple dad. I've got a son that's just about to turn 2 years old, and a daughter now that's 6 weeks old. So we've got two of them under two running around, and that's a trip.
Well, trust me, she's going to be running him in about 3 years. So
yes.
That's how that goes. Having had a bunch of kids, I know how that goes. So great. So Allison Randall is our guest this morning. Are you should be familiar with Allison because she's done everything, it turns out. So are you up to date on all that?
I was looking through the show notes because I kind of got pulled in a little bit at the last minute because I thought I had something else scheduled for today, and come to find out my time zone calculations were off, and I have plenty of time to do the show. So anyway, I was looking through the notes at everything Allison has done, and it's kind of a head scratcher because she's done so many things and been involved in so many different things. It's like, well, which one of them are we going to talk about? This could be something of a scattershot episode.
I don't know what the topic is going to be. We'll have to discover the topic. Yeah, I just kept adding things, even before and after we talked. I talked with her yesterday, and it goes on and on. There's an awful lot to it. So, but before we get to talking with her, I want to let you know that it is now January and time for the Twit audience survey. The annual survey helps us understand our audience so we can make your listening experience even better. It's completely anonymous, and it'll only take 5 minutes. So go to twit.tv/survey21 to take it. That's twit.tv/survey21. So great. So let's get on with this thing. There's almost too much to talk about. Good morning, Allison. I assume you're there because I saw you a second ago while we were preparing.
Good morning. Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. I actually should have gone into like the gigantic a list of the too many things that you've done. Almost. I mean, I actually made an outline of it. You've been involved with Perl, Parrot, which I think you started, Puny languages, including intermediate languages, lots of organizations, Perl, Python, Parrot, OpenStack, Software Freedom Conservancy, Open Usage Commons, Floss Foundations Group, which is hard to say, Open Infrastructure Foundation. You've worked for Canonical, O'Reilly, HP, SUSE. You've been involved in events like OSCON, code development conferences, probably for Perl and many others. You and I met on one of the many geek cruises, I believe, way back in the aughts.
Probably almost 20 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. But here's the difference. I told you this yesterday, and it says here you've been involved in programming for 35 years, which to me tells me you started at least several years before you were born. So, and it goes on.
Just pretend I'm a Vulcan. We're very long-lived.
And you come without the years, but with the smarts. So to get us started, let me just ask, with the too many things you're involved with, and I'm involved with a lot of stuff, a bunch of nonprofits and so forth. Everybody wants you on their board. What does your typical day look like now? I mean, how can you be involved in all these things and not be on Zoom or Skype or something 24/7? What does your day look like?
I mean, it varies wildly. I do usually have at least 1 or 2 Zoom calls every day with one group or another. I kind of like cycle through them so they each get a little bit of my time. I mean, for the past month, I've just been writing almost nonstop, but that's not related to the nonprofits. That's related to my PhD hobby. So I'm trying to finish my PhD dissertation this month.
I'm impressed that you don't have a PhD. So you're working on that. Is that?
I'm like it's one of the. It was on my bucket list. I just always wanted to do it. So I'm very late in life for a PhD, but I think it's still worth doing.
Wow. There's in computer science or in some adjacent topic.
Computer science.
Yeah, which you've also been teaching in the meantime.
I have done some of that. Yeah, I was teaching at Vassar College year before last.
Yeah, and you live near there somewhere. I can tell by the window outside window.
Yeah. Poughkeepsie is where Vassar College is, and I'm in one of the small surrounding sort of neighborhoods.
So, okay, so you've had this long history, and I have too, but mine has just been observing it. You've been actually making the world happen in the middle of this, and I'm wondering, with just to start at a high level, what are the biggest changes you've seen over those many years, from the inside, as it were, in the floss world?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about being involved for so long is, like the very early days of the 80s, it was very much, just sort of a small set of splinter groups. And then watching through the 90s as it went from, small groups to just a very few companies started to get interested and then built their businesses on it, like the Googles and the Amazons. And they didn't necessarily engage much, but they started to see, oh, this could make a really big difference in our business, like to see it not just as something interesting outside, but like this is a big deal to us. And then, we went through Netscape, and then, that big revelation of, oh, wait, a company could decide to just like release a huge project that is like was core to their business. And now they actually release it as free software. And then a few years later, we introduced the term open source. But then, like through the 2000s, that the whole idea of the term open source was, oh, well, let's get companies to adopt. And then by 2010, that had succeeded, right? So we had huge adoption of open source, but we still sort of had this like, clueless user problem. So a big company would adopt open source, but then they still wouldn't engage in a way that was really helpful. So then the past 10 years, we've had this big change where you went from companies either only using or only distributing open source to stepping through the realms of, a major focus of their business is releasing their own software as open source or contributing to existing open source projects, or the very, very top tier of participation, which is where the companies get the most value out of open source and also give the most value to it. It's kind of like that virtuous cycle is, the term I use is co-ownership. So you have companies and individuals and foundations, and they're all collaborating together on equal footing. I call it like the 3 legs of the stool. So like if you get the idea that the foundation has to control the project, it doesn't work as well. And if you get the idea that the company has to control the project, it doesn't work as well. But when you get the 3 of them on equal footing in this co-ownership pattern, then they all get the most value out of open source, but they also all give the most value to open source. And you build these really strong, healthy communities. And I think in the 90s, we couldn't have conceived that being where we would end up today. So it's actually really exciting to see that arc over time.
I'm curious. You talk about the good news in open source, and I can't help but think about a couple of the stories that we've covered over the past couple of years that are maybe not quite as good news. And the 2 of them that come to mind is one where Amazon will say, hey, that's a cool open source project. We're going to make a commercial offering around it, and kind of torpedoes the commercial offering that the guys that actually build the project are doing. And so then you had things like the Commons Clause was written to combat that. And then the second thing in very recent time is you have Red Hat pulling the plug on CentOS, really, again, torpedoing a lot of community goodwill because they went back on their word as far as how long they were going to support a particular project. I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of those two more negative stories that we've seen recently.
So those are actually both really good examples of the stool, right? So the strong, stable, three-legged stool. The first one is a case where the company was dominating the project. So you didn't have any foundation involved. You didn't have any kind of co-ownership by the developers. So the community of developers outside had no control. And the one company was not opening up to have discussions and collaborations with other companies who are interested in participating. So the ideal outcome of that would not have been Amazon releases their own fork and, the community is divided. And the ideal would have been the existing company sort of recognizes that it's an opportunity to have other commercial offerings out there for the health of the open source project, right? That it's not a zero-sum game, that there's room for more than one commercial offering, and that it's to their benefit to collaborate with all the other companies who might be interested in making a commercial offering. So what happens when they accept that, when the company doesn't try to be, this is all ours, this is our proprietary innovation that we just happen to be calling open source and putting in the open, but we don't actually want you to use it and modify it and redistribute it the way open source is, I would say, the way open source is intended, the way open source works best. So that's one really good example of that's an example of the company leg is totally dominant and has destroyed the other two. CentOS, I think CentOS kind of died a long time ago. If it had had a vibrant and thriving community, the fact that one distributor stopped distributing it wouldn't have made any difference, right? Debian has lots of distributors and redistributors, but if one company stopped distributing it, they wouldn't care, It's just okay, one company stopped distributing it. But because it really was a company project. It wasn't like Fedora. It wasn't like a healthy, independent community project. It was a company project. If the one company involved decides they don't want to invest in it anymore, that's just the way it goes. It's kind of evolution, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's okay over time to accept that some open source projects have become less relevant and just letting them die off, and sort of focusing more of our energy and effort on other open source projects. For Red Hat, they have multiple distributions. So letting the one that's sort of the oldest and the sort of least well-maintained sort of die off, it makes sense from a business perspective, but it also kind of makes sense from a community perspective.
That is a very unique take on that situation. We'll just say that.
I've not been ever actively involved in CentOS, so the only times I've seen it installed have been times where pretty consistently I think they really should have been using a different distro. Yeah. Maybe I'm just prejudiced against CentOS.
We all need to have our prejudices, actually. So I want to ask, I like the three-legged stool metaphor because, well, two reasons. One was early on there was this sort of, it was probably to some degree mythical, but, it makes good stories. And as a journalist, I like good stories, right? And stories about conflict. So back in the 90s, it was, Linux versus Microsoft. And that's not only over in Microsoft has totally embraced Linux at this point, but companies and development groups were on their way to becoming symbiotic anyway. So there were two legs of the stools, but the foundations are the third leg, and you're talking about that as the third leg, and I see that as kind of a growing leg. It's a bigger leg than it used to be, especially with the Linux Foundation, which in a way is like not only in a way, it actually is a foundation of foundations. It has foundations within foundations. For cloud native and for, I forget what the one's called for entertainment, but there's Hyperledger. Brian Bellendorf has been on the show talking about that, which is blockchain stuff. And as a way actually to kind of shepherd companies together and get companies working together with, in other words, that stool is working with the other two legs in a new way. And it's a kind of a different symbiosis. So I'm wondering, being involved in as many foundations as you are, if you could expand on how that actually works.
Yeah, I think, foundations aren't a new idea, right? Like, we've had foundations since the 90s. And we've had big, multi-project foundations like the Apache Software Foundation for a very long time, too. I think the big innovation of the Linux Foundation in the mid-2000s, mid to late 2000s, was understanding. So there's kind of like a particle wave duality in open source between individuals and groups. Companies are collections of individuals, and at a development level, it often makes the most sense to relate to them as collections of individuals, without thinking about their affiliation. But there is a level, especially when it comes to sponsorship or kind of getting your project visible in the public eye, getting it to users, things like that, where relating to the company as a company is also beneficial. That doesn't mean you forget the fact that, developers are developers, whether they're employed by a company or not. It just means at a certain level, you need to relate to a company as a company. And if you can figure out that path, then it can actually help the open source project. And that's something that Linux Foundation, they're certainly not the only one, but they made some strides forward that have actually been, copied by a lot of other foundations now, in terms of finding that way to engage with companies as companies and individuals as individuals, and kind of tie the technical goodness of open source together with kind of the business goodness of open source. In a way, that was something that, OSCON was always trying to do. It's like we were trying to find those connection points between projects and companies and users, and kind of make that fusion point where they could all meet together. And I think that's what the Linux Foundation and other foundations now do very well, is they kind of sit in this midpoint where they can sort of help support the projects, individual developers, and also help those companies find those bridge points into the project, kind of help the companies learn how to participate in a beneficial way.
Allison, if I don't do this now, I'll forget about it before the end of the show. And forgive me if this is a terrible tangent. But you mentioned you're working on your PhD thesis. What, and it's computer science related. I'm just curious. What exactly are you looking at there, and is it kind of related to this the open source world?
It's not. My master's thesis was entirely on this topic. My PhD dissertation is picking apart the speculative execution vulnerabilities and conceiving of a new way to design the very lowest level of the hardware to eliminate speculation, eliminate speculation and or control it. So provide a way that you can actually write code where you can precisely say this section of code will never be speculated. And, so that is a security benefit, especially in cloud computing. It's a security benefit to be able to say, this small section of code related to, say, cryptography or passwords, this will never be speculated. And you get that guarantee of security all the way down to the hardware. So not related to this at all.
Oh, that's interesting, though. That's kind of in my wheelhouse. One of my many moonlights is I work as a writer on security issues over at Hackaday. Are you? Cool. So I'll take this for just drill into this for just a moment. Are you working with Intel or AMD or ARM or anybody like that on this issue? Because there's lots of people that care a lot about this at those various places.
I have talked with Intel and AMD folks. I'm doing my prototype on RISC-V because it is an open hardware platform. But the point is that after I've implemented it on RISC-V, any other architecture could adopt the same techniques. It's about very, very low-level superscalar processor techniques. So those techniques could be applied in any architecture.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I once again, we've got another tangent here. What are your thoughts about RISC-V? Kind of, it's taking the open source ethos and moving it into the hardware world, which we've seen some of over the years. Do you think there's a real future there for RISC-V? Is it going to be the next to ARM, or is it always going to be a toy and a hobby for just a few of us?
It's very early days. I think it's seeing enough early adoption in real hardware architectures. So it's not like in production in like server architectures yet, but for things like hard drive controllers and things like that, it is seeing enough real world adoption by real companies. So I think it has potential. I really suspect though that Intel and AMD are motivated enough that if we do find problems, if we do find a way to solve speculative execution vulnerabilities, they're likely to be shipped by one of those companies first. And I mean, I also think you got to understand there's potential for like Intel to ship RISC-V hardware as well. I think they have the manufacturing capability. They have the integration and testing capability that I think actually an Intel processor that had like, say, a RISC-V security chip or something like that on it, or like half RISC-V cores and half Intel, existing x86 cores or something like that. So sort of an architecture, a heterogeneous compute architecture, which is becoming quite common. Something like that we might actually see sooner than we would see, say, Sci-Fi shipping large-scale RISC-V-based server processors or something like that. I don't know. Well, so it's early days, though. I mean, I'd give it another 10 years before you really make a call on the future of RISC-V.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't help but think about the fact that both AMD and Intel now own major players in the FPGA space. And I know for a fact that Intel is already shipping server processor chips that have FPGA fabric built into them. So it would not be a stretch. And I think Intel is also shipping chips that have ARM cores in them. The running, not necessarily exposed to the end user, but running some of their management stuff. I believe that is ARM cores inside. So that is not a huge leap of logic. Yeah, it's not at all. Boy, exciting times. I guess that's an interesting segue. Of all the things that you have your fingers in and you're working on, what's the one that you're most excited about?
I kind of lived in a superposition of realities. Like there isn't any one thing that would absorb all my attention at this point. But I would say the two sides are. I tend to have this global perspective of the open source ecosystem. So I serve on the boards of some foundations. I do some strategic consulting with companies. I do some strategic advising when I don't have any official position with the foundation. But I tend to view it not from the perspective of one foundation, but how is the whole, like the health of the whole ecosystem? How is it working? How is it evolving? Where is it diseased? Where is it working well? So like that is definitely one thing that occupies a very large space in my brain. And then on the technical side, this sort of speculative execution has been really taking up a lot of my time for a couple years now.
And so
let me go ahead.
Go ahead, Doc.
No, sorry. No. You go ahead.
For it,
you
Doc.
said so.
Oh,
that's
okay.
always a good.
I was going to chase the rabbit down just a little bit and take the other side of that coin. As you look across kind of the open source world and ecosystem, what are the things that worry you the most You know, if you're looking for the places where it's diseased, we could say what are the pockets that are really you see as problematic?
The things I worry about the most are when I think silos is probably the best way to put it. In the 90s, it was okay for an open source project to just focus on itself and not think about how it interacts with the rest of the world. Today, that's really not okay. If you think about, say, just an average Linux distribution, it may be integrating 60,000 different open source projects. That's not an unrealistic number. So thinking about yourself, your own project only, and not about projects downstream that distribute your work or projects upstream that you depend on, and not understanding that you need to maintain a network of relationships across different open source foundations, across different open source projects. I think that is actually one of the things that worries me most. Because that, like, a lot of those negative effects that you might see, like when you start digging deep, you see the symptoms on the surface, but when you start digging deep, the actual cause is not understanding how interconnected the open source ecosystem is, and not being willing to take the time to build the relationships and think about health more broadly than just your own project.
So to put some meat on that skeleton, on those bones, we're essentially talking about if I'm a developer at a given project, I need to at least know who the maintainers are for that project over at Fedora and Debian and Ubuntu and SUSE, let's say. Having relationships with those guys so that you can talk back and forth and understand kind of where things are at in the pipeline. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yep, and there's varying different levels like that. Just being aware that there are bug trackers at those Linux distributors that maybe you should kind of keep an eye on the bugs they have for your software. Even something as small as that, making that a part of your ordinary routine is really helpful. Whether you personally know the maintainers, that's great. And if you get a chance to bump into each other at a conference or something, or these days in an IRC channel or something, that's fantastic. But just kind of being cognizant that every line of code you write, it depends on a lot of work from other developers and other projects. Like, you build on stacks of software from other developers and other projects, and there are stacks of developers and other projects who build on your work, and being aware of that two-way impact.
I cannot tell you how many times I have personally run into a bug, and you go searching for the bug, and the only mention you have of it is some maintainer in some distro. It's like, yes, we're aware that it's here. We're working on a patch on it. We've tried contacting the upstream project, and we haven't been able to get a hold of anybody there. Oh, it's ridiculous. Yes, I very much understand how that can be a problem.
Yeah. And from a logical perspective, it makes sense, right? Because the distributors are the ones who are frontline with users. So, they get reports from users. And, in terms of that sort of agile methodology, being in contact with your customers, which in open source is your users, it's actually to the project's benefit to know that, a lot of our users are coming in through the distros. And so that's kind of a great channel of information for us.
I'm almost wondering if we're missing a Slack here, or maybe a Slack itself is already being used, where there could be better communication between all these disparate development communities. It was interesting. You said 60,000 within one just given.
It's a lot of volume. It'd be hard to have one place. Yeah.
Yes, it's. Mark Andreessen a few years ago says, software is eating the world, and mostly because the world is becoming utterly dependent on software. We're living digital lives now, and not just the analog ones into which we were born, and it's very, most people are working, our lives are lived up, at the top level of actual use without really knowing what's going on way down there. And having it open, I mean that's sort of the basic bottom level, gotta have it virtue. So I'm wondering, I mean, there's an old argument that's been going on that has showed up around the SolarWinds vulnerability that the Russians or whoever took advantage of. And but somewhere when I was reading about that, I read yet for the nth time, some corporate type saying, well, look, if this was open source, we'd be so much more vulnerable than we are with this one company. And I'm wondering if that, how does that argument play today? I mean, it seems to me we need the openness, but why are we still hearing the other side of this thing? And is there hope for that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the early arguments of open source was many eyes. Like if you have many eyes on software, it will make it more secure. The actual answer we know now is it doesn't magically automatically make it more secure, right? So having many eyes on the software gives you the potential to make it more secure if you actually use those eyes to actively scan for vulnerabilities and actively fix vulnerabilities. Simply being open doesn't guarantee that it's more secure. And so you will find people saying, oh, open means less secure. They're wrong. Being in the open and visible and having the ability for security researchers to actively scan it for vulnerabilities always gives it the potential to be more secure. But you actually have to put in the work to reap that benefit. Openness isn't a magic button that you slap on things. It's a set of procedures and processes that can be used to make better software, but you actually have to kind of follow through on that open design, open development, open community, like all those things. They take work.
There's I forget who said it, but it's relevant here. The one-liner was "Hell is other people," and there's and I think with a lot of developers, hell is users. And one of my dreams from the beginning has been, and as soon as I first found out about free software and open source, going back into the 80s, was that, wow, I as a less technical user, I'd like to be involved more in the way software gets developed, in the way, and it isn't just like I want one more feature here. It's that, and it really comes from knowing that. I mean, there's a corollary to Bill Joy's law. Bill Joy famously said most of the smart people are working for other companies, and my corollary to that is most of the smart people are actually the users. Most of them for companies. Most of the smart people are actually the customers. They're not working for you. They're not in the employee base. And I think something that both businesses and open source development groups share in common is that they think they're the ones with all the agency than the people who are actually using or buying this stuff. And I haven't seen yet the mechanism by which the, what people actually using this stuff can get, not just feedback on, hey, that was good, that wasn't, but how this could be improved. And is there something like that out there yet?
You have hit on one of the big innovations in open source in the past 10 years, and that is open source projects who get how important their users are and prioritize giving not only a channel of communication, but actually participation in governance to the users as well as the developers. I would say the most evolved form I've seen of that is in the Open Infrastructure Foundation. So they've really, really actively over the past 10 years taken to engaging users to the point that their technical committee, they've changed the name. For a while they had a user committee and a technical committee, and they've now merged. So their body of governance includes both expert developers and expert users who, for their projects, they're operators, right? But these are expert users who deploy their software. And that perspective adds so much value to the conversation because these are the people who really feel the pain of the rough edges of the open source software. And so even if they don't have the skills to develop the patch themselves, making them part of that active dialogue and conversation is incredibly valuable to open source.
I run a small business where I take care of computer problems for other small businesses. And something I've learned over the years is every one of these people that I work with are smart enough that if they put the time into it, they could figure out how to run a computer just as well as I could. They just have enough to do already running their business, and they make more money running their business than they do trying to fix their computers. And in a lot of cases, it's the exact same thing. You have lots and lots of people that are using software that, if they wanted to put the time into it, yes, they could learn how to program and or fix these bugs, but they've got their plate full enough already. So that's a very interesting angle to put on, or a perspective to look at the entire open source ecosystem from. There was a story, this came to mind, and it's kind of on topic, I think. There was a couple of years ago a module on NPM called, I believe, FlatMap-Stream. No, Event Stream. It's called Event Stream. And the guy that was working on it, that was the primary maintainer, had kind of burnt out and gotten to the point where he hadn't done much maintainership on it for a while. And he got an email from another contributor who said, "Hey, I see that you're not doing a whole lot with this package. I would like to see it continue to live. Would you transfer the maintainership of it over to me?" And he was overjoyed and thrilled that somebody wanted to pick up his work. And he said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." And so he handed the reins of the project over to Right9 Control, was the username of this guy. And within a couple of weeks, there was a new version of the project released that had malicious code in it. A Bitcoin. Let's see, what exactly was it? Some bit of code in there to try to steal Bitcoin wallets. And as we talk about kind of the open source ecosystem and security with open source, I'm reminded of this. Being open source is not it's not a panacea. It's not a universal cure. There's still
it's an opportunity. Yeah,
right,
it's an opportunity,
right.
But it's not a guarantee. Yep.
It's a tool. It is another tool, a super powerful and important tool, but it's another tool in our kind of universal quest to make computers secure and to be able to do work on them, and not a silver bullet.
Yeah, and that one's really unfortunate because it's like there's all kinds of things in there that's like, maintainer burnout, and how do you build trust, and how do you design governance of open source projects so that you can, you can trust the leaders of the projects, and it's a tangle of a whole bunch of different factors, and the result is terrible. But it's not just one thing. It's like a whole bunch of different things that, there's a web of things that could have prevented that. In that case, it's just thing after thing went wrong. And, I would say the biggest lesson to learn from that is if you are a single person or a small number of maintainers on an open source project, always, always, always work on training your replacements. Even if you don't have any plans to retire, always have at least 2 replacements in mind that you're actively recruiting and training and getting prepared to take over the reins for you, because you never want to hand it off to a complete stranger. That's just a bad position to be in. Yeah. So
there's an interesting there's a tangent off of this that I think is probably important to talk about. If I thought about this earlier, I would have pulled up the XKD comic that talks about this. One of Randall Munroe's comics, he talks about how all of the internet is held together by this one package that's maintained by one guy in Iowa. and especially with Node.js and NPM, you find a lot of this where there are these extremely simple packages. In a few cases, they're just single lines of code that people have turned into a package to be able to do some. There was one of them in particular. Like left align or right align. I don't remember the name of it, but it was like a single line of code that was used in 100,000 different projects. And for whatever reason, the maintainer got ticked off over something and deleted the project, and half of the internet stopped working. And it's interesting to think about that because you have, you obviously have these extremely large projects. You've got the Linux kernel. You've got The GNU compiler project. You've got LLVM. You've got Systemd. You've got these big projects that everybody knows about. But you've also got these little tiny projects that hardly anybody knows about, or hardly anybody is interested in contributing to. Like, for example, one that I've heard about several times over the years is the Network Time Protocol. And for the longest time, the Network Time Protocol was maintained literally by one guy who did not have a whole lot of money to do it. But and there are so many things that depend upon NTPD working correctly. There's a few of those that nobody thinks about, but they're super important. And so I'm curious, is there something that we could do? Is there a project out there that you know of where people are looking for these important projects to make sure that they continue to be maintained? What are your thoughts about kind of these important but dusty corners of the ecosystem?
It's one of those. It's one of the great strengths of open source and one of the great weaknesses. In the strength, it's that just one person can step up and do something, and it can become massively useful to hundreds and thousands of people. Like, that's a strength. The weakness is, over the long term, maintainers do burn out. Stuff happens. So I'd say, yes, there are some very conscious steps towards this. One was, the Linux Foundation started the Core Infrastructure Initiative a while back. I don't know how active it is anymore, but that was one very conscious effort. The Ford Foundation, was investing in open source sustainability and, how do we find those projects that are neglected and get them the attention that they deserve, which is not any one answer. I think one useful, it's not a fix, but it's one useful example of a very large scale body of software kind of solving this problem in one way is the Debian project. Early on, Debian had a very strong culture of single maintainers. Like, one maintainer has ultimate control over the few packages that they develop. Over time, Debian has actually developed a strong culture of collaborative maintenance, which is, instead of putting your foot down and saying, this package is mine, even if I haven't looked at it in 5 years, it just really welcomes new maintainers coming in and picking up the work. And, if a package needs to be updated and a new maintainer brings it in, then, other members of the community will support them and review their work and help them get it in so that it gets released. And I think, obviously it's hard to do that across all the open source projects in the world. But I think in general, the culture that we need to develop to combat that sort of one developer, when they're gone, and that's it, is kind of understanding that this is a generational thing. And, open source is going to be around for decades. And recognizing that a lot of us are getting older and we won't be around forever. And just kind of being welcoming to the fact, you have to build in checks and balances, because you do have that risk of someone malicious picking up a well-known package just to use it, just to kind of slip some back doors in. You got to watch out, but just intentionally, consciously sort of building that understanding that, project ownership shifts over time, and we need to look out for those key projects that are, carrying a heavy load, but not getting the investment of attention they need to keep going. And looking, it's kind of like a systematic open source project survey across the entire ecosystem. And I do know some people who have been kind of working on that quietly, but working on that, trying to do the research to find those at-risk projects. It may not be a disaster yet, but just there's a risk there, and it needs more investment for the benefit of the whole ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to look at the Linux kernel is one of the big examples, obviously, of an important project. And I know Torvalds talks a lot about. I think he is the one that uses this term. I know he talks about the idea of the bus factor. If Torvalds gets run over by a bus tomorrow, there are 5 different guys that are already in place among the Linux community. Greg KH is one of them that would just
Yep.
naturally step into the head maintainership role, and the Linux kernel would continue rolling on. And so they've thought about it in that perspective, and they've got that taken care of. But one of the other things that I've heard some of the Linux guys talk about working on the kernel is the people working on the kernel are getting older, and there are not enough young people coming in to work on it. And I have to wonder if that is just a matter of it takes more than a couple of years of experience to be able to write code at the level of the kernel and really be able to dig into it, or do they need to do we as kind of a community need to do a better job of getting young programmers interested and into writing code for the kernel? And I'm just curious, is this a problem that we see everywhere, that developers are getting older? And then you also have to think, well, is that a problem because open source has only been around for X number of years, and so there's going to be an aging, and it's not a problem? Or are we seeing fewer and fewer young people getting into open source and writing code? I'm curious what you think.
I mean, it is partly just this is the first time through with open source, right? So we've kind of clung to the early founders because they were the early founders, and we haven't yet been through that phase shift of actually the founders are around no more. So some projects have. I mean, like the Debian project from a very, sorry, I keep pulling them out, but for a few things, they're a good example. From a very early, they never had a Linus Torvalds. They had a founder, but the founder was only involved for the first couple of years, and they have had regular cycles of project leadership ever since. So some projects have had that, sort of active turnover, but in some projects, the founders love their project and they stick around and they keep working, and that's fine. That's a good thing. But we have, it's actually just in the past few years, we've had a few, prominent founders step down or, at various different reasons. I've had to have a change of leadership, and I think it's just sort of eye-opening. So it's partly just we've hit that point. Partly, I think the world of development in general has changed. There's a lot more software developers in the world now than there was in the 1980s. But, the average experience of the average software developer tends to be much, much higher level today than in the 80s. You have far fewer developers coming through who cut their teeth on C and far more who cut their teeth on JavaScript. So in a sense, there's kind of a longer arc, a longer learning cycle from, that my first taste of software was JavaScript to developing the Linux kernel. You can totally get there. It takes longer. And I think the other thing is, there isn't a lot of hiring for young Linux kernel developers. I would say, you don't really, you have companies who hire Linux kernel developers, but they want the really good ones, the really well-known ones. And I haven't really seen so much of, okay, let's hire one really excellent Linux kernel developer and then 5 junior people. And, we'll consciously train up the next generation of Linux kernel developers. I haven't actually seen that. Doesn't mean it's not out there, but that is one way that you kind of breed the next generation of developers. I also haven't seen a big foundation program, say the Linux Foundation, doing a big, Google Summer of Code or Outreachy, we're going to sponsor 5 college students every summer to learn how to do Linux kernel development or something like that. I haven't seen that kind of. And that's really what it takes. It's not an impossible task. It takes active work to think about, where do we get that next generation of developers from? How do we get them from, JavaScript to Linux kernel development?
Yes, there is a great gulf between those two worlds, starting with JavaScript versus working on the nitty-gritty of C. I guess the thing that comes to mind is when you get young people involved in something as big and complex and as important as the kernel, how do you make sure that your code quality stays good? Isn't that one of the big problems with trying to get new developers into the kernel or any of the other super complicated packages. Your on-ramp, rather than being a nice gradual on-ramp, is just this extreme curve straight up. To be able to even get a line or two of code accepted, you've got to be programming at a really high level.
The answer is the same as with anything, and that is start small. Their code quality is not going to be great at first. Don't start them working on, big, heavily used, really important, modules. Start them working on staging. Start them working on, I think the first patch that Greg KH had me do in the Linux kernel was on something called Comd. It was just like some code. It wasn't in main. It wasn't shipped with the main release kernel releases, but it was in staging to eventually make it in. So he just had me doing code cleanup. So you start them on really low level stuff and have them gradually work their way up. The thing about the Linux kernel is there's so many really excellent developers contributing to it that it can be a little discouraging at first. But you kind of have to look at it from the long term. Maybe have them work on some other C projects as well. Have them do a little general open source maintenance work. Have them do some, security vulnerability scanning across a bunch of different projects. It's like any skill. You learn it by doing it. So the more practice you can get, the better you'll get.
That's interesting. There are actually two directions we can go here, but let me just see if there's more in that thread. On one of the Geek Cruises that Linus was on, he was asked about, what makes a great programmer, and he gave Andrew Morton as an example of somebody who had not been in the community, stepped in and was really great because he was kind of like a great musician. He had the chops, he could do it, and he called it taste. And he described it as something like an art, good carpentry, and only in a very practical sense. You want this piece of furniture, all four legs have to be steady on the ground, and it comes in looking good and only gets better as bugs get patched. And I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, but it's one of those things I picked up on one of those trips that I thought that has stuck with me over 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's something that's a really important point. We think of technology as if it's either as if it's a talent, it's built in, or as if it's a purely technical skill. But being a really good programmer is something you learn over time, so it's not something you're born with. And also, it involves parts of your brain that are not, strictly logical. It involves those artistic sides of your brain that, see patterns, and kind of over time you develop those instincts to know good code from bad code. There's a lot more to it than just sort of a cut and dry, drop someone in, sink or swim. That's all there is to it. Done. It's a complex human brain development sort of topic.
I was thinking, as another programmer I talked to once who said that the hardest thing about it is very much like with chess. You need to know a lot of dependencies. There all these dependencies are in your mind at all times, and that does take training. That is not something you're just born with. Obviously, somebody can have a predilection of one kind or another, but there's something to say for Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. I mean, if you work on dribbling a basketball for 10,000 hours, you can do it. There are 10 videos of guys that are 5'7" that learned to stuff a basketball in a 10-foot basket because they worked at it for a year, or something else like that. That's skills improve over time. Because our time is limited here, I want to go back for a second to the Infrastructure Foundation, because the Open Infrastructure Foundation, I had to look it up. I used this internet thing to find out that used to be the OpenStack Foundation, and I didn't know that. That's why I didn't know what it was. So there are two things to that. One is what happened to OpenStack, because I think that's a case in a number of points, whatever that is. And the other is how can one get involved, or who should be getting involved in that? Because it sounds very interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. Sort of two different questions on that. So I mentioned that open source strategy is one of the things I do. OpenStack is one of the projects I've worked with on strategy for a very long time now. Actually, I probably had the first strategic conversation about OpenStack before it even had the name OpenStack. So I've sort of, some of the founders were involved in Ubuntu. I was technical architect of Ubuntu at the time, so there's some long history there. But I would say the arc of that is like the Apache Software Foundation. OpenStack Foundation started as a single project foundation. And then, over time, they recognized that actually these interdependencies between multiple projects meant that actually there was value in hosting some of those projects themselves, and a huge amount of value in collaborating with projects at different foundations, but also value in hosting some other projects that aren't OpenStack or aren't even really directly related to OpenStack, but that fit within some key strategic areas. So we actually mapped out those key strategic areas. So the projects that the OpenStack Foundation welcomed in were very consciously in cloud computing or 5G or, open infrastructure in general was kind of like the strategic area we defined. And, eventually it got to the point that, now sometimes people forget that the Apache Software Foundation, that was originally just one project. And then they kind of renamed the project to HTTP. But it's still kind of named Apache, but so Apache means both the project and it means a foundation that's a lot bigger than the project. But we realized that actually that in this particular case, for this particular group of people, it actually made more sense to rebrand the foundation and keep the name OpenStack on the project itself. And the other side you asked about was OpenStack itself, the project. So not the foundation, but the project. I don't know. I mean, I guess you probably remember. You've been around so long. In the mid-2000s, the Linux kernel went through this sort of weird growth phase where it was shifting from kind of an interesting project to a mass-adopted project to kind of, I would almost call it like a baseline assumption. It's just there. It's not sexy. It's not, hype. It's just there, and it's going to be there a really long time. So that's what happened to OpenStack. So it went through this hype cycle where people are like, ooh, OpenStack, cool, exciting. Kubernetes is kind of going through that too. It's like people they kind of even overhype it. They just get super excited about it. And then it hits a point of, large scale adoption. So if you look at the adoption of OpenStack across the world, it's a bunch of different companies because it's open source. It's a bunch of different deployments, but the total compute capacity deployed in the world of OpenStack is actually greater than Amazon's compute capacity. It's just not one company. So you can't just look at one company and say that's the OpenStack company. And it feels a really important niche in the ecosystem, which is to say, if you need this kind of compute infrastructure, but you need it in-house, or you need it in a particular country jurisdiction for legal reasons, or you're just a small local ISP and you want to provide it to your customers to make a little more money, but you don't want to outsource that to Amazon. Amazon would eat all your profits, so that doesn't make sense. So it's kind of it fills that niche that open source does fill, of making the software accessible at a low cost, high quality. But then the hype cycle dropped off, right? So OpenStack is a key piece of infrastructure around the world, but it's not sexy anymore. And that's actually totally okay. That's an important layer of the open infrastructure ecosystem. It's an important layer to fill, and it's going to be around for multiple decades. It's going to be around for a while, like the Linux kernel. But we don't really get super excited about it. We don't get crazy hype anymore. For a period of time, there was that OpenStack is dead meme. It kind of reminded me of the Perl is dead meme. That people kind of got off on. You hear it less now. And some of the strategic steps that we took with OpenStack that I actually wish we had taken with Perl and we didn't, call that a learning experience for me, is really actively combating the false meme, because OpenStack is not dead. So really actively engaging with Kubernetes and other projects that are high on the hype cycle, because in fact, OpenStack is quite valuable both as the layer underpinning Kubernetes and as a layer over Kubernetes. So using Kubernetes to deploy OpenStack, it works well either way. But like really actively engaging with the projects that are high on the hype cycle, or engaging with other projects that are base layer, like Linux distributions, sort of actively engaging with those projects, and sort of keeping an active presence. I wish we had done that more with Perl, whereas Perl kind of like, it's still actively used. That's the weird thing, but it kind of like drifted into like almost resignation, accepting the false label or the false meme of being dead.
So
I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it does. And I have a stack of other questions here, and I'm sure Jonathan does too, but we're actually at an hour now. So we generally bring this home with some quick final questions. One is, and if you could answer briefly, is there anything we haven't asked you that you would like it if we had, and we can work it in just before we get off?
Not anything particular.
Yeah.
No.
We
managed to keep a focus, which is actually really good considering, how many places we could have gone.
Yeah. What I wanted to ask is about conferences, because you've been involved in so many of those, and I have too. Like conferences got turned off with the pandemic, like this year. It's like they're done, but what happens now, and what happens after that, and that's it. We'll just have to save that for another show, and we'll have to have you back. A couple more. What are your favorite text editors, your favorite text editor and scripting language? I can guess at those, but that's a kind of control question.
Text editor, Vim for anything related to code, but I also use just gedit for like little text notes and things like that. But if it involves actual syntax, then Vim. Scripting languages, I would say the two programming languages I've used most in the past 2 years are Rust and Python. For very different, I tend, like, in all those places that I've used C for most of my life as a programmer, in the past, like, 2 years or so, I've used Rust. So instead, if it's new code and not just maintaining old code, sort of I've kind of transitioned my new code to Rust. And Python is really just, for whatever reason, a lot of the projects that I'm interested in or involved in are in Python. And if I have to write like a little script for some little command line task or something, these days it's usually Python 3.
And you haven't mentioned Perl, which I've totally associated with you with over the years.
I know, it's one of those weird things. I haven't actually written. I did some consulting, so like I did some consulting in Perl probably 4 years ago was my most recent, like large Perl code base, and they needed a maintainer who understood it. So I've done some of that over the years, but I don't tend to use it so much these days as like my first go-to language. And it's not really any particular reason. It's just sort of like happened.
Well, this has been fantastic, and I really love having had you on the show, and we will have to have you back. We said it to everybody, but I mean, in your case, there really was so much uncovered that we could digress on. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
A great hour here. Yeah. So Jonathan, how was that for you? You had some great questions there, I thought.
Yeah, well, it's fun when we have a guest like Allison who has such a wide breadth of knowledge that pretty much any topic that comes to mind we can ask her about, and she'll at least know what we're talking about and have an opinion on it. Every once in a while, like with the CentOS questions, she will surprise us, but that's okay. That's part of the fun of getting to talk to people. If everybody had the same opinion as we did on topics, there wouldn't really be a point of asking them questions. But really interesting to see, another thinker in the realm of open source and kind of where we're headed with open source. I thought it was one of the things that maybe I'll walk away thinking is the most interesting is that conversation kind of about the long-term history of open source and this thought that we're on the first cycle of this as far as human lifespan.
That was a keeper for me. It's like,
like,
geez, we've been at this thing for 40 years and we're still starting out. Yeah. Right.
But you think about it, and you think about kind of the first time that we really started writing computer programs as humans was back in the 40s, let's say, the 50s. Well, we're just now getting to the point to where that has hit the average human lifespan. And so you think about the things that we've been doing kind of as humanity for thousands and thousands of years. We've been building buildings, and so we've gotten really, really good at building buildings because we've been doing it for 100 generations. We've been writing computer code for 1 generation. I mean, that is just a mind-boggling thought. You think about, well, what is this whole thing going to look like after 5 generations of writing computer code? And that is quite a different way to look at the world than anything than in any other interview I've walked away with.
There's a topic that I don't know who to interview for, but it's incredibly interesting. I've written a little bit about it, which is that all of construction was really that we use now, which is frame construction in the wood kind with 2x4s and nails, and that was born in 1836 with one project, and everything since then has been done with it, and the important thing about it is that it makes it possible. Frame construction, you can make anything with it, and at the same time, it's very easy for anybody to become a carpenter and participate in it, where before that it was a guild level master and learner kind of thing. But another interesting thing about it, and actually Stuart Brand has a lot to say about this, is that buildings, the building materials turn over like every 7 years. I mean, if you go back and look at what was sold in hardware stores, there's some things that are always going to be sold, nails and hammers and so forth, but lots of other things, drills, sheet metal screws, lots of other things are new and change on a more or less constant basis. And so you have to stay up with it. And I think we're only beginning to get into that with software. We're also getting to be out of time, and I'm going to have to do post-production on this. So let's get into the plugs here. So what do you have to plug this week, Jonathan?
Oh, so we touched on it a little bit. Yes, we touched on it a little bit. One of the things I care a lot about is security. And so over at Hackaday.com, they let me write a weekly security article. And that is what I will be spending most of the rest of today working on. And that should go live Friday morning. So there's Hackaday. Go check it out, Hackaday.com on Friday morning, and take a browse through my security article. And then, keep an eye out there. I do some other things from time to time.
Yeah, and my plug, I'll just put one again at the end of the show here. Go to twit.tv/survey21 because we want to know what you think and everything. We have to operate on having knowledge. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been a great show. I don't have a guest listed for next week yet, but it's going to be great, I'm sure. So thanks again for joining us at Floss Weekly.